The company has a detailed confined space entry procedure. It is the employee's responsibility to be aware and have the knowledge necessary to enter a confined space. Although this video is a brief introduction to the company's procedure, employees shall refer to the safety manual for detailed instructions. No employee shall enter any workspace deemed to be a confined workspace by a DACON entry supervisor or the client company without obtaining a properly executed confined space entry permit from a DACON entry supervisor. The DACON entry supervisor shall post the permit next to the entrance of the confined space. The DACON entry supervisor must perform or personally witness the test for oxygen and combustible gases in the confined workspace before approving and signing the permit. Forced ventilation is required inside all confined spaces. Air monitoring equipment must remain in any occupied confined space. A confined space attendant shall not leave his assigned workplace unless properly relieved by another qualified DACON attendant assigned by the entry supervisor. The entry supervisor is responsible for the issuance of the confined space entry permit and must be aware of all the hazards associated with the permit. The entry supervisor verifies that all tests have been conducted and all procedures and equipment necessary is in place. The entry supervisor will discuss all aspects of the permit with all affected personnel. The entry supervisor can and must terminate any permit when conditions warrant such action. The entry supervisor will verify that communication means are available and functioning between entrant and attendant and that rescue services are available and the means for summoning them are operable. The entry supervisor is to remove any unauthorized and untrained individuals and verify that attendants and entrants are properly trained. The entry supervisor must verify that all entrants have vacated the confined space prior to terminating the confined space entry permit. If the entry supervisor needs to leave the job site while work is in progress, they must transfer their work duties and responsibilities to another qualified DACON entry supervisor. The new entry supervisor shall sign the confined space permit. As an attendant, you must be aware of the hazards that may be faced in the confined space, including how exposure may occur and the signs, symptoms, and consequences of exposure. You must be able to understand and interpret the conditions of the confined space permit. The attendant must also be aware of the behavioral effects of hazard exposure on authorized entrants and maintain a continuous count and identification of the entrants in the confined space. An attendant must never leave the outside of the confined space unless properly relieved. The attendant must be able to communicate with the authorized entrants as necessary. The attendant is never to enter the confined space even if needed for a rescue. The attendant is to summon help as stated on the confined space permit. The attendant is to warn all unauthorized persons to stay clear of the permitted space. If an unauthorized person enters the confined space, the attendant is to notify the authorized entrant and the entry supervisor. Remember, as an attendant, you are not to perform any duties that may interfere with your primary duty to monitor and protect authorized entrants. As an authorized entrant into a confined space, you must be aware of the hazards that may be encountered and be able to recognize signs and symptoms of exposure. The authorized entrant must know how to properly use any needed and required equipment to detect, eliminate, and minimize the hazard. Communication between the attendant and the authorized entrant is mandatory. This is to allow the attendant to alert an entrant of the need to evacuate. The authorized entrant will alert the attendant whenever a hazardous condition develops within the permit space. Additionally, the entrant must be able to understand and interpret all conditions of the confined space permit and exit the space as quickly as possible whenever an attendant gives an order.